Chapter 1. The hammer falls. The House chamber was a cauldron of barely suppressed fury, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. As Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic House Minority Leader, stood at the podium, his voice resonating with barely controlled rage, his eyes flashing as he turned his ire not toward the Republicans, but toward his own party. "This bill," he thundered, gesturing with a dismissive wave toward the freshly passed legislation, "is a betrayal, a sellout, a Trojan horse filled with Trump's poisonous agenda." The object of his fury sat stone-faced across the chamber, absorbing the verbal assault without reaction, his expression unreadable, but his posture tense. Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, had done the unthinkable. He had defied his party's hardliners and voted in favor of President Trump's bipartisan spending bill, a bill that had been framed by the White House as a necessary measure for national security and economic stability, but had been vilified by progressive Democrats as a capitulation to Trumpism. The betrayal felt personal, and Jeffries wasn't about to let it go unchallenged. "Chuck," Jeffries continued, his voice now dripping with sarcasm, each syllable sharp and deliberate, "perhaps you'd like to explain to the American people why you chose to dine with the devil." The Democratic caucus erupted into murmurs, some nodding in agreement, others exchanging nervous glances. Knowing that this wasn't just another policy disagreement, this was a fracture at the highest levels of their party. An internal war playing out under the scrutiny of the national press. The cameras zoomed in on Schumer, waiting for his response, waiting for a sign that he had either regretted his decision or would stand firm in defiance of his own party's leadership. Schumer rose slowly, his movements controlled, his shoulders squared, his face impassive but his eyes sharp as they met Jeffries across the room. "Hakeem," he said, his voice calm but firm, "this bill wasn't perfect, but it secured funding for vital programs, prevented a government shutdown, and protected key democratic priorities. It was a compromise, a necessary one." The chamber stilled, the weight of Schumer's words sinking in, but Jeffries wasn't finished. "A compromise?" he echoed, his voice filled with disbelief. "Chuck, this wasn't a compromise. This was a surrender, a blank check to Trump to steamroll his agenda while we sit here and pretend we got something out of it." He knew the American president craved a victory, a signature achievement to cement his legacy, something that he could hold up to the world as proof that he, and he alone, had brokered peace where others had failed. He knew that Trump's mind operated differently than those of the bureaucrats and career politicians in Washington. The deal had to be big, bold, and unmistakably his. "Do you know what you've done? You've legitimized his so-called leadership. You've given him a legislative victory right before an election, and for what? A few token gestures that won't mean a thing when he uses this as proof that even Democrats support his policies?" The progressive wing of the Democratic Party, already on edge, murmured their agreement, their gazes locked onto Schumer, like a pack of wolves sensing weakness. Schumer took a breath, exhaled slowly, then shook his head. "Let's not pretend we live in a fantasy world, Hakeem," he said, his voice measured but carrying a quiet authority. "You stand here and denounce this bill as a betrayal, but what was the alternative? A government shutdown? Economic instability? Another manufactured crisis that would have hurt working families while Washington played political games? You want a grandstand? Fine. But leadership means making the hard choices, and this was one of them." The chamber fell silent. Even Jeffries, despite his anger, knew that Schumer was playing the long game, that he had weighed the risks and had determined that keeping the government running, even under Trump's terms, was a battle worth fighting. But the rift had been exposed, and there was no putting the genie back in the bottle. Schumer's decision had split the party into two factions: the pragmatists, who saw this as a necessary evil, and the purists, who saw it as the ultimate betrayal. The media was already running with the story, painting it as a civil war within the Democratic Party, a sign of a fractured opposition incapable of unity at a time when Trump was consolidating his own power. Jeffries had made his move, Schumer had held his ground. And now, the Democratic Party stood on the edge of a precipice, unsure of which direction it would fall. "Compromise?" Jeffries spat the word like venom, his voice cutting through the chamber like a blade. "It was capitulation. You've handed Trump a victory, and you've undermined everything we stand for." The words hung heavy in the air, thick with anger and the unmistakable stench of political warfare, sending murmurs rippling through the chamber. The tension was palpable, a suffocating weight pressing down on the assembled lawmakers. some watching with barely concealed amusement, others with growing unease. From the sidelines, Nancy Pelosi observed the scene with a knowing look, a familiar weariness etched on her face, her fingers tapping absently against the arm of her chair. She had been here before, had seen countless power struggles within the party, and she recognized Jeffries' ambition all too well, his hunger for power, his relentless push to reshape the party in his own image. But this public attack on Schumer felt reckless, a bridge burned too soon. Jeffries wasn't just challenging a political decision. He was declaring war on the old guard of the Democratic Party, and Pelosi knew exactly how dangerous that could be. In the days that followed, the fallout was swift and brutal. The Democratic Party, already fractured between moderates and the progressive wing, was now caught in an all-out internal battle, one that played out not just behind closed doors, but in the press, on social media, in fundraising emails that painted Schumer as a sellout and Jeffries as the future. Cable news networks pounced on the drama, turning the feud into prime-time spectacle, dissecting every quote, every reaction, every strategic maneuver with the breathless urgency of a breaking scandal. Jeffries, emboldened by the fury of the progressive base, refused to back down. Instead, he doubled down, escalating his attacks, painting Schumer as a traitor to Democratic values, a collaborator, a man who had willingly sold his soul for a seat at Trump's table. He took to the airwaves, to town halls, to social media, hammering the same message over and over again. Schumer had betrayed the party. Schumer had legitimized Trump's agenda. Schumer had abandoned the fight. His speeches grew more fiery, his rhetoric more extreme, and with every appearance the divide within the party deepened. Moderates, many of whom agreed with Schumer that keeping the government running was more important than ideological purity, began to feel the heat. They were attacked online, shouted down at events, accused of being complicit in Schumer's so-called betrayal. Some began waffling, softening their defenses, afraid of being swept away in the storm Jeffries had unleashed. Meanwhile, Schumer, though bruised, refused to be cornered. He rallied his allies, calling in favors from powerful donors, longtime party operatives, and seasoned lawmakers who had weathered political infighting before. Behind the scenes, he met with Pelosi, with Biden's senior advisors, with the most influential Democrats in the Senate, urging them to hold the line, to push back against what he framed as political nihilism, masquerading as purity. He knew that if Jeffries' attacks went unanswered, it would set a precedent, that the Democratic Party would no longer be governed by those who could actually govern, but by those who shouted the loudest, those who wielded outrage like a cudgel. But even as Schumer fought back, it was clear that this battle had taken on a life of its own. The progressive base had tasted blood, and they wanted more. The Democratic Civil War had begun in earnest, and there was no telling how it would end. Chapter 2. Miller's Shadow. In the West Wing, Stephen Miller, Trump's deputy chief of staff, watched the Democratic infighting with undisguised glee, his mind already calculating the next move. He had spent years orchestrating political maneuvers, exploiting division, and turning the left's chaos into fuel for Trump's dominance. And now, as Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer waged a public war, tearing their own party apart over Trump's bipartisan spending bill, Miller saw an opportunity too valuable to waste. The Democratic Party was eating itself alive, and he knew that Trump could do more than just sit back and enjoy the spectacle. He could shape it. The battle between progressives and moderates was no longer just a policy dispute. It was a defining struggle over the future of the opposition. If played correctly, Trump could turn this division into a permanent fracture, leaving the Democrats weak, rudderless, and unable to mount a serious challenge in the next election cycle. He saw the cracks forming, the way the media was amplifying the dispute, the way donors were starting to hedge their bets, unsure if they should continue backing Schumer's pragmatism or throw their lot in with Jeffries' progressive zeal. The Democrats were caught in a trap of their own making, their internal power struggles spilling into public view, their weaknesses exposed for all to see. Miller was not one to let an opportunity pass. This was a chance to strike at the very foundation of the opposition, to plant the seeds of doubt, to fan the flames of division until the Democratic Party was too broken to function as a cohesive force. He strode into the Oval Office, where Trump sat behind the resolute desk, his fingers tapping idly against the polished wood. The president had been monitoring the situation, absorbing every detail, his expression unreadable, but his instincts razor-sharp. He had seen this game played out before in business, in politics, in the media, A war between egos, between factions, between men who wanted power but did not understand how to wield it. Miller stood before him, brimming with anticipation. "Mr. President," he said, his voice steady and confident, "Jeffries is tearing the Democrats apart. Schumer is vulnerable." Trump leaned back slightly, narrowing his eyes, considering the implications. He knew Schumer well, a career politician, a survivor, a man who had spent decades navigating Washington's corridors of power, making backroom deals, cutting compromises that kept him at the top even when the tides turned against him. But Jeffries? Jeffries was different, a firebrand, an ideologue, a man who wasn't just fighting for a seat at the table. He wanted to flip the whole table over and rebuild it in his image. That kind of uncontrolled ambition was both a threat and an opportunity. If Trump had learned anything in his time in business and politics, it was that men like Jeffries could burn everything down, including their own party. Schumer, for all his faults, understood how the game was played. Jeffries, on the other hand, was a man driven by pure ideology, by the belief that compromise was weakness, that revolution was the only path forward. That made him dangerous, unpredictable, but also easy to manipulate. Trump's fingers stopped tapping, his smirk barely visible. "Schumer's always been a survivor," he said slowly, his voice measured. "But Jeffries, he's got a fire in his belly, a dangerous fire." Miller nodded, his own smirk growing. "Exactly," he said. "And we can use that fire to our advantage. Imagine, Mr. President, a Democratic Party without Jeffries. A party led by someone more pragmatic." Trump raised an eyebrow, leaning forward slightly, sensing where this was going. "Someone like Schumer?" he asked. "Perhaps," Miller said, carefully choosing his words. "Or perhaps someone else entirely. The point is, Mr. President, we can influence the outcome. We can shape the future of the Democratic Party." Trump exhaled slowly, his mind already moving through the possible plays, the angles, the opportunities. He had always believed that winning wasn't just about what you did. It was about what you convinced your enemies to do to themselves. And right now, the Democrats were doing half the work for him. If he pushed the right buttons, pulled the right strings, whispered into the right ears, he wouldn't just win the next election, he could reshape the opposition for a generation. He could turn their strengths against them, make them fight amongst themselves until they were too divided to mount a serious challenge. He leaned back in his chair, his smirk now fully formed. "How do we do it?" he asked. Miller was already prepared. "We amplify the divide," he said. "We leak carefully curated information. We highlight Jeffries' most radical statements, make moderates uncomfortable. We plant stories in the media about how he's alienating donors, losing the confidence of key Democratic operatives. Meanwhile, we frame Schumer as weak, as a man unable to control his party, unable to lead. We don't let them unite against us, Mr. President. We make them fight each other." Trump chuckled, shaking his head in admiration. "This is why I keep you around, Stephen. You think like a winner." He tapped his fingers on the desk again, the rhythm slow, deliberate. "So, let's do it. Let's make them tear each other apart." Over the next several days, the plan was set in motion. Conservative media outlets began running stories that painted Jeffries as an extremist, out of touch with the working-class voters the Democratic Party claimed to represent. Quotes were pulled, taken out of context, turned into attack ads that ran in moderate Democratic districts. At the same time, whispers spread through Democratic circles that Schumer was losing control, that donors were getting nervous, that his leadership was being questioned behind closed doors. The effect was immediate. The rift between the progressive and moderate factions widened, spilling into public view. Jeffries, unwilling to back down, ramped up his attacks on Schumer, accusing him of being complicit in enabling Trump's policies, of failing the Democratic base. Schumer, under mounting pressure, was forced to defend himself, issuing statements that only further alienated the progressive wing of his party. And Trump watched it all unfold, knowing that he had just done what he did best. He had let his enemies destroy themselves. As the chaos within the Democratic Party reached its peak, Trump stood on the stage at one of his signature rallies, basking in the cheers of his supporters. "Look at them," he boomed, his voice filled with amusement. "They can't even lead themselves, and they think they can lead America?" The crowd erupted into laughter and applause. "This is what happens when you don't have strength. This is what happens when you don't have vision. And this is why we're going to win." The chants of USA, USA echoed through the stadium as Trump grinned, knowing that the battle had already been won. The Democrats were too busy fighting each other to fight him. and as long as they stayed that way, he had nothing to worry about. Miller, standing off to the side, smirked as he watched his strategy unfold perfectly. The game was theirs to control, and they would keep playing it until there was nothing left of the opposition but a fragmented, leaderless party, unable to stand against the force that was Trump's movement. Chapter 3. The Old Guard. Nancy Pelosi, sensing the danger brewing within her own party, summoned Hakeem Jeffries to her Georgetown home, a setting she had always used for serious conversations, the kind that determined the future of Democratic leadership. The air was thick with unspoken words, the weight of political history pressing down on both of them, the ghosts of past battles lingering in the quiet, dimly lit room. She had spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of Washington, making deals, outmaneuvering opponents, and holding her party together in moments of crisis, and now she was witnessing it fall apart before her eyes. The war between Jeffries and Schumer had spiraled beyond a simple disagreement. It had become an existential crisis for the Democratic Party, and Pelosi knew that if the infighting continued, it would not be Trump they had to worry about in the next election. It would be their own inability to lead. It was a tenuous connection, legally speaking, but in the world of political optics, it was dynamite. While there was no direct evidence that Boasberg had acted improperly, no proof of collusion or back-channel influence, the connection was enough to raise uncomfortable questions. Trump seized on the discovery immediately, his instincts as sharp as ever when it came to shaping narratives, understanding that facts mattered far less than perception. He didn't need proof of corruption, he just needed enough doubt, enough suggestion, enough smoke to convince the public that there was a fire. Within hours, he had amplified the connection through his media channels, unleashing a relentless barrage of attacks across Truth Social, Fox News, and conservative radio, portraying the revelation as undeniable proof of Boasberg's deep-seated bias. Conflict of interest! One of his posts screamed, his trademark all-caps declaration turning the allegation into an undeniable statement of fact. Boasberg's own family is tied to radical left-wing groups that opposed my immigration policies. How can anyone think he ruled fairly? He should have recused himself immediately. This is corruption at the highest level. The right-wing media ecosystem exploded, running non-stop coverage of the Boasberg conflict, filling airwaves with outraged segments, bringing on legal analysts who framed the revelation as a serious ethical breach, a failure of judicial transparency, a fundamental betrayal of public trust. Trump's surrogates flooded news programs, hammering the same talking points, demanding investigations into whether Boasberg had improperly ruled in cases involving immigration policies while being personally tied to advocacy groups fighting them. Republican lawmakers, many of whom had hesitated in backing Trump's impeachment push, now saw an opportunity to justify their support without looking entirely partisan. The narrative was set. And whether Boasberg had actually acted improperly no longer mattered. What mattered was perception, and Trump knew how to use that better than anyone. Chapter 5. The Tide Turns. The revelation of Judge Boasberg's wife's connection, however tenuous, shifted the narrative in a way that no legal argument, no procedural defense, and no appeals to judicial independence could easily counter. Suddenly, the debate was no longer solely about the sanctity of the courts, nor about Trump's aggressive rhetoric toward the judiciary. It was about fairness, impartiality, and, most dangerously for Boasberg, the appearance of impropriety. The question was no longer whether Boasberg had broken the law, but whether he could be trusted to rule impartially on politically charged cases when his own household was tied to organizations that had actively opposed the administration's policies. Even some of Trump's most ardent critics, those who had spent years dismissing his attacks on the judiciary as authoritarian posturing, began to acknowledge that Boasberg's position was becoming untenable. It wasn't that they suddenly believed Trump's broader narrative about deep state corruption, but rather that Boasberg had been placed in a position where his rulings would always be viewed with suspicion. The integrity of the judiciary relied not just on judges being fair, but on the public perceiving them as fair, and with this revelation, that perception was beginning to crumble. Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, sensing the change in the political winds, subtly shifted his position. Just days ago, he had been walking a careful line, balancing his loyalty to Trump with his broader concerns about attacking the judiciary. But now, with the media narrative evolving, with polling showing that even independents and moderate voters saw the Boasberg revelation as problematic, Johnson acted. He called for a congressional investigation into Judge Boasberg's conduct, framing it not as an impeachment attempt but as a necessary review of whether the judge had acted ethically in overseeing cases directly affecting policies his wife's former clients had opposed. The messaging was sharp, precise, difficult to counter. This wasn't about judicial overreach anymore. It was about transparency, about ensuring the American people could trust their courts. Senator Lindsey Graham, always the pragmatist, quickly echoed Johnson's call, standing before a packed press conference, his tone measured but firm. The American people deserve to know if a judge ruling on immigration policy has ties, direct or indirect, to groups that have actively fought against those policies. This is not about partisan politics. This is about faith in our institutions. A thorough investigation is necessary to restore public confidence in the judiciary. Graham had always been one of Trump's closest allies, but he was also keenly aware of when to pivot, when to position himself as a reasonable voice among chaos. He wasn't outright endorsing impeachment, but he was giving oxygen to the growing calls for Boasberg to be scrutinized, ensuring that the issue remained alive, that it wouldn't fade under the weight of procedural defenses. Even within the Supreme Court, the ripples of the Boasberg controversy were being felt. Justice Brett Kavanaugh, one of Trump's own appointees, remained deeply concerned about the president's initial attack on Boasberg, still wary of what a full-blown assault on the judiciary could mean for the long-term credibility of the courts. But even he couldn't ignore the questions that had been raised. He privately urged Chief Justice John Roberts to encourage Boasberg to consider recusing himself from future immigration wars, framing it as a way to preserve the dignity of the court and prevent further politicization of the judiciary. Kavanaugh wasn't endorsing Trump's attacks, but he saw the writing on the wall. Boasberg had become a liability not just for Trump's enemies, but for the entire judicial system. The pressure was mounting, and Boasberg, for the first time, found himself in an impossible position. His defenders were dwindling. His reputation was no longer that of an impartial arbiter, but of a judge whose credibility had been compromised by forces beyond his control. And as the calls for investigation and accountability grew louder, the question was no longer if Boasberg would survive this storm, but rather how much damage would be done before the inevitable reckoning arrived. Chapter 6. Victory. Faced with mounting pressure from all sides, Judge James Boasberg made a difficult decision, one that would forever mark his tenure on the bench and set a precedent for future battles between the judiciary and executive power. He recused himself from any future cases involving President Trump's immigration policies, a move that, while not an admission of guilt or wrongdoing, was undeniably a concession to the relentless scrutiny and political firestorm that had engulfed him. In a carefully worded statement, Boasberg maintained that he had acted impartially, that every ruling he had made was based on the law and not on personal or political affiliations. But, he acknowledged, public trust in the judiciary is paramount. While I firmly believe my decisions have been based solely on the law, I recognize that the appearance of a conflict of interest could undermine the integrity of this court. It is with this understanding that I will recuse myself from all future cases involving the administration's immigration policies. The recusal was a victory for President Trump. While he hadn't succeeded in removing Boasberg through impeachment, while the judge still remained on the bench, technically unscathed, the reality was clear. Boasberg had been effectively sidelined from one of the most critical legal battlegrounds of Trump's second term. The administration's deportation policy, which had been temporarily blocked, could now move forward, the road cleared of its most formidable judicial opponent. The narrative Trump had so carefully built that activist judges were deliberately obstructing his efforts to protect the nation had, in the eyes of his supporters, been validated. He had proven that when he fought back, when he refused to yield, even the judiciary had to bow to the pressure of public accountability. Yet the outcome was more complex than a simple win for the president. The Boasberg saga highlighted the delicate balance between judicial independence and political accountability, the tightrope that the judiciary had always walked in a nation where the courts were meant to remain insulated from the whims of elected officials. It underscored the importance of perception, the reality that even in the absence of direct evidence of wrongdoing, the mere appearance of bias could erode public trust in the judiciary. And it served as a stark reminder of the power of political pressure, of the fragility of institutions that, once thought untouchable, could be forced to bend under the weight of relentless public scrutiny and executive authority. Trump, basking in the glow of victory, did what he did best. He seized the moment and took to Twitter once more, making sure that the world knew exactly what had just transpired. Boasberg recuses, another victory for the American people. Drain the swamp, MAGA. And the tweet, as always, was a lightning bolt, igniting instant reactions across the political spectrum, setting off a new cycle of commentary, outrage, and celebration. But this time, it struck a different chord. This time, it was not just about one battle won. It was about the war that would continue to rage. It was a declaration that the fight between the executive branch and the judiciary was far from over, that the battle lines had been drawn, and neither side was willing to back down. The gavel and the gauntlet had been thrown, and the echoes of the meeting in the Supreme Court would resonate for years to come, shaping not just the future of Trump's presidency, but the future of the American justice system itself. What had started as a single ruling on deportation had evolved into something far greater, a test of power, of institutional resilience, of whether the judiciary could remain truly independent in the face of a president who refused to play by the old rules. And in that moment, as Trump watched the reactions pour in, as his allies cheered and his opponents fumed, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The fight was far from over. Trump had once again outmaneuvered his opponents, proving that even within the chaos of Washington, he could pull the strings when it mattered most. The Democratic Party had been weakened, not by Trump directly, but by their own internal collapse, a division that he had merely encouraged, exacerbated, and guided to its inevitable conclusion. Jeffries had been silenced, and with him, the progressive wing that had threatened to turn the Democrats into a party of permanent resistance rather than governance. Order had been restored, and now, with Schumer neutralized, with the Democratic Party licking its wounds, with the progressive wing leaderless and fractured, the Trump agenda could continue, unimpeded. The path forward was clear. The swamp had turned on itself, and Trump had simply stepped aside to watch it happen.